Today, I will be breaking down Jordan Peterson's appearance on Jubilee. Now, I'm not really sure what position Jordan Peterson defends, because from what I can tell, he's a neo-quasi-Jungian, Christian, Gnostic, whatever his position is, because he's very unclear when he speaks about Christianity. So, we'll see his position. I don't expect too much from him, but who knows? Maybe this will be an enlightening experience that he'll provide amazing arguments I've never heard before, or use the good arguments that I know. But
you're a Christian. You say that. I haven't claimed that. Oh,
well, that's not a good start, is it?
what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
Don't be a smartass.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing. Right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him. Hello there. I'm Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'm a clinical psychologist, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, an author, a podcaster, public speaker, and today I'm surrounded by 25 atheists. My first claim: atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
So I agree with this, but I highly doubt he's going to make a philosophical argument here. It's probably going to be something about psychology. Because I watched a bit of his debate with Matt Dillahunty, and he was kind of talking a lot about psychology in that debate. And I think you can take a psychological angle and get into a good transcendental argument, but I mean, he debated Matt Dillahunty. I mean, that's not really that big of a challenge, but we'll see what happens. I don't want to be like just a hater saying it's going to be terrible, but I'm trying to be honest. All right, but I agree with this on the philosophical view. We'll see if he articulates in a way that I agree with.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peterson.
How are you doing?
So this claim here that atheists don't know what they're rejecting. My background is in studying to become a traditional Catholic priest, daily mass, daily rosary, going on long retreats, deep into the magisterium and biblical hermeneutics. Like, I was thoroughly in it. And it seems like I do know what I'm missing. Is there something that I missed over years of study, both this issue formally and living out religion so deeply?
Well, you obviously feel that you missed something when you were practicing for the priesthood. Your aim was off then. So there's always the possibility that it's still off now.
What was off about my aim in the first place?
I don't know. That might take a long time to figure out.
But then it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how they understand those aims to be. How is it that you can claim that people don't know something that you know about their life despite not having met them?
Well, it's obviously a generic claim, just like the atheist claim that there's no God is a generic claim. In your case, it would have to be specified more, and I'm not claiming to understand what was going on in your mind, but my experience with...
So here, this is a very uncomfortable position. See how he squirmed? See his posture? Now, granted, those chairs suck. Like, those type of chairs are very hard to sit properly in. But this is one of the reasons why I would never want to do something like this. Like, I see, people tell me all the time, oh, you should go on, like, Dean's TikTok or Parker's TikTok. I don't know if he does, like, TikTok debates like Dean does. Or you should, go up to this person, like, go here and talk to this person. I don't want to be in these positions because, what I realize about a lot of people is they judge someone's credibility, ability, based on how they can handle random, in basketball, they say, Jordan played against plumbers. I don't think that's true, but literal plumbers in the sense of, oh, well, they're small fry the tomato cans, don't really know what they're doing, in a position where they're the authority and they're just some guy trying to challenge that authority, right? So this dynamic puts Peterson in a big advantage. So there's no reason why he should lose. I mean, there's no reason why he should lose to an atheist ever, right? If you just have transcendental arguments. But even more so, you should never lose when you're in this power dynamic. So let's see how this goes. I'm just noting the uncomfortability, which is natural, given
with atheists
the context.
Is twofold. Is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they've often been hurt by someone who was religious or by the religious enterprise or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
But I think that you have a reductive view of what atheism is. You've defined religion so broadly to include any sort of having aim in life, any sort of cultural archetypes or having a metaphorical substrate. And atheism to you is a very specific type of like three people in the world that are these Raskolnikov type of, they want to get away with a perfect murder. It seems like you have the reductive view of what an atheist is.
Well, let's start with your claim.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define the God that you're rejecting? Like, what is God to you? You studied in the church, you found that unsatisfactory. How would you characterize what you rejected?
I think the average Christian believer, when they say that they're Christian and they believe, they mean some sort of God that is all-powerful, all-perfect, is somehow involved in the matters of this world, and that we look to them through wisdom and with Logos incarnate in Christ. And it also seems like you don't believe in religion in the way that the average Christian says that they believe in religion. And there are as many gods out there as there are believers, because everybody has mutually exclusive and different views of what God is. So it seems
Well,
like...
if everybody had mutually exclusive views of what God is, no one could speak to each other. The mere fact of communication presumes a commonality of assumption and definition. And it's certainly not the case that I regard any
That's a good argument. So that's a bit of like a meta level argument. That's good. Okay.
archetypal manifestation whatsoever as equally religious. So that's not a real claim. Let me give you an example. For
Precisely.
example, there's a
And before his example, I don't really like the way he went into it, but that's a decent argument.
sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded with a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that God is characterized in the Old Testament stories.
Yes.
Now, Moses is a faithful servant of God and a good man. At least that's the case within the confines of the story.
One possible
It's
interpretation.
the case within the confines of the story, obviously. But
Well,
there's
not
a,
obviously.
there's,
When we look at the Bible can't precisely say anything because there are so many different exegetical and hermeneutic views of this particular book, and that everybody has everybody has disagreed historically on, it seems like, even the most benign detail about a book this big. And it seems like you can only say that the Bible says something if you first presuppose that it's univocal.
Okay, so there's two things I'm going to say. One, Peterson basically had a layup, and then he fumbled. Like, what he should have said is that he had a good point there. Communication presupposes something. He should have gone more into the presupposition. Say he started talking about Moses and how it's obvious. I mean, technically speaking, in this context, that's a fallacy. And then he rebuts back with another somewhat fallacious argument saying that, well, no one can agree on anything. The point Peterson should be making here is that in order to even criticize these positions of any type of Christian, you need logic, you need epistemology, you need ethics, you need metaphysics. How can you ground that on an atheistic worldview? You can't. So you can't make internal critiques then, because you can't epistemically ground any of your ontological claims, which simply means you can't justify the logic you're using. Of course, you would agree that you can use logic, but on your worldview, you don't have a justification for it. That's what we would say. Unfortunately, Peterson wasn't able to get into that point. I don't know if he would make that point, but now he also said something about, unless you presuppose or something to the effect of that. And yeah, the reason why he doesn't see it from the angles because he trained as a Catholic. Trained, quotes, I don't know if it's the word they use. Learning to be a Catholic priest, right? And they have a view of natural theology, which does have this problem of not really being able to empirically, because Aquinas, the primary Catholic theologian, took Aristotle's framework, which is an empiricist framework, natural foundationalism, Descartes, and basically I would argue that Humean skepticism is very difficult to deal with for the Catholic position, and also the Protestant position that just affirms the same kind of framework as Catholicism, which most of them do, because it's very hard to get from there to God, and I would even argue that there's a good chance that you can't. So
your claim essentially is that Moses in the Old Testament plays the role of a villain or is irrelevant, because the alternative claim
I'm
is
saying
that
that we
he's
can't
good.
know, because we can't talk to those authors.
If you are going to start with the presupposition that there's nothing I can say about any of these stories that you're not going to disagree with from the perspective that there are multiple potential competing claims, then I can't speak with you. So
And
you
we
have
also have a short time here, so I'm I want to get to the core of what you're arguing here, and I'd love if we could.
The core of what I'm arguing is that atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. So I'm trying to give you an example of what's being rejected and its complexity. Okay, so God rewards Moses with a glimpse of the divine. So this is a definition of the God that atheists are hypothetically rejecting.
A possible one.
I said
Yeah.
I didn't say the. I said
That is possible, yes.
Okay. So despite the fact that Moses is a stellar character and he's had a long and difficult life and can withstand a lot of difficulty and travail, God puts him between two cliffs. So he can just see a crack of what's in front of him. And when God walks by, he allows him to see his back. Okay, so the implication of that story is that the divine is fundamentally unknowable. It's a pinnacle experience, and that people in their finitude have to be shielded from a comprehensive vision of the basis of reality. Well, that's not the God that's defined in that manner, right? It's not a simple personification. It's not a simple old man in the sky. It's something that in its essence is unknowable and overwhelming. And that isn't, in my experience, the God that's defined by atheists who are attempting to undermine the story. I mean, it's the same claim, for example, that you're a finite creature and that you face something that in the final analysis is unknowable, and that you have to establish a relationship with it regardless of your inability to perceive or even withstand perceiving the whole. Okay, is there a problem with that?
I mean, the problem is that when we look at, famously, when you've been asked, do you believe in God? The question becomes, what do we mean by God? And in the Bible, it's not even clear if the biblical authors know what God is, because Yahweh has historically emerged from an early storm god, a deity that doesn't exhaust the category of deity, and it has changed over the Old Testament. Does God have physicality? Does God not have physicality? It seems like, yes, if you define religion to mean anybody that has an aim, anybody that looks at the unknown, anybody who wants to go from chaos to order is inherently religious, then yes. But also in the same way, I could define atheist as somebody who doesn't dogmatically believe in a religion, or somebody who doesn't regularly attend religious services or belong to a denomination. Help, especially the audience, kind of like boil this down. There was a lot of words there. That the central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite. A central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
No, I said that we were finite and we had to establish a relationship with the infinite.
Yeah, and then in that case, then we're all religious, but...
Does Jordan Peterson believe in essence energies distinction? Because that's the only way what he's saying could ever make sense, because he's saying, going into the story about Moses, I don't see the point. Like, maybe... Again, like, I know about Jungian psychology, I know about psychology, so... I mean, maybe he's turning into a story so it's more appealing to people, but... I mean... telling a story isn't a justification. And I understand he's trying to illustrate the point of the unknowability of God, but he could have just said that. Right? Makes it very... He obfuscates what he's trying to say, right? But I understand he's saying that the essence is unknowable, and I would agree with that. But I would also then say... But we can get to know God through the energies that come from the essence. So, if he doesn't affirm essence energies distinction, then he's actually in the same boat as the atheist. He's just said God is inherently unknowable in his essence. So if he doesn't believe in essence energies, then it logically follows that he doesn't know God either. It's very interesting. I wonder if that'll get fleshed out, but
then I can do the same thing and define one particular element of atheism. It seems like we both have a reductive view of what the other side looks like, to the point where a conversation seems incoherent, and not just incoherent, but not in the way that the average Christian understands Christianity to be.
Do you have a problem?
Let's pause there. Sorry, you've been voted out by the majority.
oh boy, it's Parker.
Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you,
David.
David, good to see you.
Tell me everything that you know about the Polynesian deity Lono, L-O-N-O.
Oh my god, and here we go with the... Well, you know, the Christian God is similar to, like, this pagan God, so, like, you're wrong. Here we go.
I don't know anything about the Polynesian deity Lono.
So you're rejecting something without knowledge of what you're rejecting.
I'm not rejecting it.
Do
No
you
more than I'm rejecting
believe in
anything
Lono?
that I don't know anything
Do you
about.
believe in Lono? Do you believe that he is a deity that exists in the world, exists in the universe, that exists in the existence of everything? Do you believe that Lono
I'll
is a
answer that
deity?
question once you answer my question, which is, do I reject everything that I'm ignorant of? Because that's your presupposition that undergirds your argument, and unless you can prove that that's valid, then there's no point.
My question is quite simple.
Yeah, but that doesn't
Do
mean
you
it's
believe-
formulated accurately.
Do you believe?
Yeah, okay. So that's a good point there from Peterson. People make this mistake all the time saying, well, it's a simple question. Well, first of all, you can't reduce things just to be simple, right? That's what dumb people do. And also, just because it's simple doesn't mean it's right. So that's a very good point there. Yes, I say this from experience, people don't understand how simplicity works.
Believe that Lono exists? Yes or no?
I'm not going to answer that question for the reasons I just described. You already insisted that if I reject something, that if I'm ignorant of something, I reject it. Do you think that everyone in the world has to know everything simultaneously for that to be valid and true?
I think in order for your
Answer that
argument
question.
to be true, in order for it to be true that we atheists don't understand what we're rejecting, then you need to also apply that to yourself and to Christians and to Muslims and to any other person on this earth, where if you don't understand what you're rejecting the belief in, then you can't reject the belief in it. That's the implication of your
I didn't
claim.
say that I rejected the belief in Lono. I said
it's
I didn't
Lono.
know who Lono was. I didn't
Right.
say anything about rejecting.
That's because I've asked you several times and you haven't, but let me get to my...
I guess that is true. I mean, the prompt isn't that good, but it's pretty clear where he's coming from. The myth vision, the pagan god, disproves Christianity. Like a Romulus, he's like Jesus. So Jesus, false. I mean, that in and of itself is a fallacious argument. But
even greater point.
the point is they're atheists, and they still have the same problem I talked about earlier about grounding ethics, epistemology, metaphysics.
You're saying atheists don't understand what religion is or what God is in order to be able to reject it fully or completely. We have someone over here who studied it in their own way. I've studied religion. I have a degree in religious studies, specialty in Christianity and Mediterranean traditions. And further than that, beyond me, Pew Research studies suggest that atheists and agnostics actually know more about religion and about religious stories, the foundational principles, than believers.
That's because they're more religious than they think they are.
Okay.
Okay, that's actually smart. So see, I have a psychological understanding of a lot of things. Like I have my own mind model. I talk about the mind all the time, and that is true. Everyone has an image of God, but my contention is that there's a true and a false image of God. This is where one of the many points where I diverge from Peterson and Young. I believe there actually are objective truths. So, for example, they would say that it's not necessarily wrong for a man to act like a woman and then a woman to act like a man in a relationship because their energies will complement each other. Right? It's still both sides. I would argue, well, that is wrong because there is a divine command for... It's not right because of the command. It's right because God's nature is good. He commands from his nature. But there's a divine command for men to be masculine, women to be feminine. Of course, the balancing elements of integration of opposites from there. And they join together. Having the other way around is wrong. They wouldn't say that's necessarily wrong, right? So that kind of goes the same thing here. There is a true image of God and a false image of God. I would say the true image of God is the Trinity. False image of God is basically anything but that. So whether it be a vegan who just supports veganism is what he answers to. So whether he likes it or not, veganism is the image of God, or whatever figure he associates with veganism, whether it be imaginary or physical.
They're concerned with deep matters, and one of the defining characteristics of someone who's oriented in religious direction is that they're concerned with deep matters.
Okay.
In fact, it's virtually definitional.
Right, but they also have to identify with a religious tradition and accept the foundational stories that go along
Well,
with
that would mean more that they're sectarian than that they're religious. And most people, for example, in the United States, deny that they're religious but accept that they're spiritual.
Pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
It's pretty boring so far.
Aha! Hi, nice to meet you.
How are you doing?
Good, how
What's
are you?
your name?
I'm Greg. Nice to meet you.
Greg.
Okay, so
He
I feel like
He
you're
looks like a kid. Oh, what the hell? How did I just do it? What? Oh, okay. I hit something on my keyboard and this thing, it looked like it just turned off the audio. Okay. So this guy looks like the kid from Monster House.
getting at this
Let's zero him out.
idea
Let's zero
of
him out.
polysemy, where we have multiple related meanings for a word, right? Like, for example, a famous painting can be emotionally moving in that it changes my emotional state. And when I was on the highway coming here to the studio, I was physically moving. I was changing my position.
Should I make jokes? Like, is this wrong? I was physically moving. Not enough, okay? I couldn't stop myself, okay? Oh, you're so mean. I know.
If I said, I believe the Mona Lisa is very moving, and you said, you don't really understand what you're saying, it's nailed to the wall, I would say that you're the one who doesn't understand what I'm saying, not the other way around. And the way that relates to this is there are many concepts of God, and I'll admit, I find a lot of what you say about that interesting. I'm familiar with it. The idea of this kind of Jungian hierarchical thing, or as a metaphor or a symbol, or the kind of, atheist, materialist, literalist idea of a agentic, omnipotent, omniscient being that intervenes in reality, right? So when I'm saying that I reject the concept of God, I'm aware of these other definitions of God, but I think that when we use words, we tend to only imply one meaning at a time. So the same way that I would say the Mona Lisa is moving emotionally, but I would not say it's moving physically. I would say I reject the concept of God in this very literal way. But
What literal way?
the way that God is this omniscient, omnipotent, agentic, supernatural being that sent his son down and has, caused miracles and all these things like that. The idea of God is
Do you
like...
think that there's an underlying unity of things?
Could you explain that question?
Well, scientists, for example, believe that science unifies in a comprehensive theory. Do you, yes, no, or that
know
there are
that people-
multiple competing truths? Those are the options. Either things unify or there are multiple competing truths.
I think that, I know that, for example, like in physics, people are looking for like a theory of everything.
And why do you think they're doing that?
It's interesting, it's helpful.
But they also believe that there's an underlying unity to things.
In a sense, yeah, like like the material world and time and space are probably governed by universal laws and principles.
Partly that, yes, yes, but that the same thing might extend to a broader domain that would include imagination and value.
Could you help?
So I think what this guy's saying is interesting. This is a somewhat interesting point. Interesting in that I haven't really heard this angle before. Not really interesting in that it really advances Christian versus atheist. I understand the claims, atheists don't understand what they're saying. I hope there's more interesting questions after this, because this question/claim I don't find to be that interesting. But Peterson, again, like I said, he has a very obfuscated view of what God is, and I think as I watch, his position seems more and more like he just believes in the archetype of God and not necessarily the literal God, right? So I think this whole point is just gonna be about semantics. So, and it wouldn't be so problematic to engage him. Like, all these people have problems engaging him because he just doesn't make it clear what he's saying. But I think he's saying the archetypal view of God, and he'll probably also say, well, I don't necessarily reject the literal view of God. He'll probably say something like that, but let's keep going.
Help me connect that to the prompt.
Well, I'm trying to define God, the God that I don't think atheists do a very good job of defining. Here's another question for you. What do you think guides you in your determination of whether or not what you're saying to me is true?
Can we go back? Can we stay on what we were talking about?
We are.
Okay.
You're just uncomfortable with the question.
No, I feel like you're just kind of throwing different spaghetti at the wall.
I'm not.
Okay.
I asked
All right.
you a very specific question. What is it that you think guides you when you're talking to me to help you determine whether what you say is true?
Logic, memory, reasoning,
Okay.
sensory information.
How do you distinguish that from being governed by something that's false?
Okay, we have a good point here. This is a good point. This is a presuppositional argument springboarded in the weirdest way possible. But he's in it. Let's see if he keeps it going.
An interesting question.
How do you know the difference when you
it
speak
is.
between what's true and what's false? So you can
I
imagine
infer, right? I can infer. I can.
from what principles?
Yes.
So, and what are you getting at?
I'm getting at the fact
He's getting at the fact that you can't epistemically ground your position.
that your conscience guides you. Is that
Okay.
reasonable?
Conscious is defined by
Conscience.
my empathy and my reason are my foundational.
Define it any way you want.
Okay, so that's how I'm defining my conscience. Is my my conscience is my sense of
Right
and wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
does that come from?
I would say that comes from an evolved capacity to empathize and a recognition of the benefits
story
of
isn't an
engaging with and
argument.
nurturing that capacity. And then that empathy is constrained and guided by reason, right? Like, for example, I am driving down the highway. There's a kitten in the road. I'm going to empathetically feel, oh my God, I want to save the kitten. But then reasonably, like, I'm going to get hit by a car, right? So that's sort of the process through which I make ethical decisions.
Right, so he's an atheist, so I'll assume that he logically follows that up by saying, well, that's how, because we're talking about truth. Like, how do you know whether or not what you're thinking is true? I'm assuming that he would then say, well, that's how I know it's true. It's like, well, a story doesn't give epistemic justification, right? This is what the atheists do all the time. Like, well, morality evolved from evolution, and, this is how we ground morality. Yeah, telling a story doesn't ground anything. You need to give an argument, a logically sound argument.
Okay,
Is
how do
empathy
you
constrained by reason?
do you think that people can differ in their response to something empathically?
Yeah.
Is there a mediating principle that can tell you one person who's empathic and another person who's empathic that disagree who's correct?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we'd have to, talk it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
We do that in real life all the time when we have,
Whoa.
whether that's a discussion with a friend about the right thing to do in a situation, whether that's a policy discussion about law, right? That's where we can converse with each other, think about things, explain our perspectives, and then kind of reach a conclusion, right? That I think that we do that all the time.
Yeah, so this guy doesn't, from what I can see, he probably either doesn't understand or doesn't suggest a objective morality. Because that, like, everything he's saying is in the subjective moral realm, which is a problem because then you can't ground anything
So a lot
in terms like universal. So you can't say, well, this claim is true. For example, it is true that my monitor is in front of me. You can only say that from the perspective of your own experience. And even if you got other people to confirm it, that'll be perspective from your experience of their experience. So you would be stuck in this box of your own consciousness. You can never make a universal claim that would apply to everyone. So I wish Peterson kind of articulated in that way, but he's getting at the point here. This is a lot better than before.
Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I see this is kind of goes back to what I'm saying initially.
I'm
where,
not defining it. Elijah
okay,
defined
so
it.
as Elijah defines
It's
God.
defined that way in Jonah too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also
got
defined it that
as,
way.
as I'm sure you know many people who defined it that way. And it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm
okay.
just pointing out to you
Got
how
it.
God is defined in the Old
Okay.
Testament.
All right. So to respond to that, I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God. And that goes back to my kind of
Then
opening
how
statement.
do we specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, or again, it goes back to my example of the
I'm
Mona Lisa.
defining God as conscience.
Okay. So that's interesting, but
Well, it's funny because, like, based on the past, 15 seconds, I would assume he's arguing for Neville Goddard's position. Neville Goddard's position that God is the I am. Very interesting. So, yeah, you just said, yeah, I define God as consciousness. Christians would reject that. Okay, God is not merely consciousness. All right, he has the attributes of omniscience, omnipotence, etc. So, there you go. I mean, he's had trouble. I don't know if he's had trouble or he's obfuscated or etc. or he doesn't understand, but he is now actually given his position very clearly, and yeah, it's not really Christianity. It's not true Christianity. He believes in Christianity.
then you're kind of expanding the meaning of
No,
God.
I'm not. That's how it's
He's
defined
basically
in the
agnostic.
Old Testament.
Okay, so-
in Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever. So
It's
some.
not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the
Okay.
major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets.
All
Right?
right.
He's equal in stature to
Can-
Moses.
okay.
Right. So it's
so-
not arbitrary.
All right. So that is interesting, but it's not relevant to the context with which I am using the term God.
It's directly relevant. Atheists reject God, but they don't
Right,
understand
but you-
what they're rejecting.
you're
You
being-
accept conscience as a guide, and conscience
think-
is one of the defining characteristics of
I think-
God in the Old Testament.
I think you're being intellectually disingenuous
In what way?
because
I
again,
asked you if you believe that conscience guided you.
You just asked me a question and then you stopped me from answering it. In this setting, you understand the way I am using the term God and belief.
Not
and
in
then
the
you're-
least. I don't understand how you're using it in the least. That's why I'm trying to define it. My definition of God as conscience is a lot more precise and oriented than
But-
your definition of the God that you
But
hypothetically disbelieve in.
it's irrelevant to the fault lines of this debate.
How is it irrelevant?
Because in common parlance, when we're talking about atheists, God, belief, not belief,
I
we're
don't
not
care
talking.
about common parlance. I'm trying to get to something fundamental.
I think your point is irrelevant to the way that people tend
Which
to use
point?
these words. Your point that there are these polysemous
I didn't make
ideas
that
of God.
point. You did.
I did. Well,
I made a
I
specific
characterized
point
it,
that God
right.
was associated with
I
conscience.
just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
All right. Well, it was very nice to
Yes,
meet you.
nice
I appreciate
to
the
meet you too.
conversation.
Yeah. It's very brave of you to do this.
Thank you.
So, yeah, and the funny thing is, okay, this is why Peterson seems to make terrible argument, good argument, bad argument, bad argument, bad argument, okay argument. The reason why is because he defines God as consciousness, so when he's in any realm outside of consciousness, he starts appealing to things that don't really matter. But when he's in the realm of talking about consciousness or anything like that, he then turns into a presuppositional argument, which is good. That's why he's so inconsistent in the quality of his arguments. Now, I'm happy to have him explicate further what he means by God being consciousness, but again, it sounds like the Jungian and even the Godardian, whatever, Neville Goddard's position, right? Which is very interesting, which is, like I say, certainly not Christianity affirming, first and foremost, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found
Okay, this is a
within
good claim.
science.
This is a good claim. These atheists should get crushed on this.
What is up, Mr. Canada?
How you doing, man?
I'm doing great.
What's
How are
your
you?
name?
Brian. I think it's interesting that you say that morality and purpose can't be found in science. Actually,
Not within science.
sure.
Yeah.
Purpose, I actually grant you, because purpose is subjective, right? Unless you want to boil it down to the purpose of life is just to procreate, right? Sure, whatever. Morality is actually something that we do see. We actually have examples of.
Okay, this is going to be all about is-ought distinction. So, an is not ought, as the atheist philosopher, I would say the best atheist I've personally seen, David Hume, still not a good debater. You can't just go on with David Hume level arguments and win, I would say. But he's the best I've seen from the atheists. Okay, and what he said, which I agree with, is that an is, like for example, it hurts when you get killed. Let's just say that, right? It hurts when it happens. You can't then therefore say it is wrong, because that's an is. You don't derive an ought from an is. Okay, unless you commit some logical fallacy in an argument. So for example, you would have to say it hurts when someone hits another person, so hitting other people is wrong. Just very simple premise, right? You would then have to add in a premise of saying, well, if something hurts, then it's wrong, which is a fallacy, right? How would you ever be able to ground that? And then you can get therefore the ought. So you can't just get ought, you can't just go is ought. You have to go is fallacious premise ought. So that's why you can't get an ought from an is, okay? I know I said the word is ought a lot, but you're smart, you can understand.
Neanderthals, an older individual was found in a tribe, missing an arm, missing teeth, still alive somehow in his 40s, 50s, right? Typically, you're a Neanderthal, you can't eat, you can't hunt, you die, right? But we know that members of his tribe were taking care of him, right? So we know that at some level, early in our evolutionary history, we actually developed altruism. We have examples of chimpanzees who actually have a basic understanding of fairness, right? If you give a chimpanzee 2 grapes, right, and his buddy gets 3, right? He actually freaks out, right? But you give both chimps 3 grapes and they're good. We have examples of parrots. I think
Except
it's
for the
parrots.
greedy chimps.
Except for the greedy chimps.
They want four graves.
They want 4 graves. You know, those do exist, right? But we have similar examples where we do animal tests, right? And
So morality is intrinsic.
I think
So it precedes science.
that actually
right?
a better way to define it would be that social animals, which we are, right,
Yeah.
require some level of morality or
Into what?
into-
I'm not disagreeing.
Sure,
Why do they require that?
because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with
Sure.
regards to science. Thank you very much.
Is that
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
how's it?
Yeah. Okay. Like I said, he should crush everyone on this. Even if he flounders, even if he does dumb things, which I'm not saying he is, but even if you did, this claim that morality can be found in science is dumb.
Not scientific.
And because it's not derived from the scientific process, as you just
It
indicated,
doesn't
am I
need to derive from
pointing
the
to?
scientific process.
Well,
It's
hang
the
on,
fact that
hang on a second.
we are social animals, so we need that to exist as a group.
I
right?
agree, but
Sure.
you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not
That's
how that
my
works.
point.
Science explains it. So you
No,
just,
science doesn't explain morality.
it doesn't explain how social animals would need to be.
It explains an is. It doesn't explain the ought, which you need to have in order to have morality.
Well, that's
Not
a
true, is it?
that's a complicated question.
Is it?
Okay. For example, to make it more clear, because I feel like maybe if I say this, more people understand. So let's take the monkeys, okay, or chimpanzees, whatever you said. 2 grapes versus 3 grapes. Okay, when you say, well, when a monkey got 2 grapes and one got 3, and this one was mad, that demonstrates a form of morality, them understanding morality, and 3 equal. That's another form of morality. Morality is a separate thing from the situation, right? So in this case, this on his worldview, this would be an example of morality. Okay. Now, what can you say to someone who says, well, it was actually fair for one to get 2 and one to get 3? There's nothing to say there. So aside from like, well, that's not fair. Okay, well, why is not being fair wrong? And then he either flounders or he just circles back to, well, in our empirical data, we have seen that humans like fairness. So therefore, fairness is right. That's my impression of the liberal atheists like Richard Dawkins, without the British accent.
But we see it though.
Yeah, but explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality
Is that a
itself
guy
are
or
the same thing.
Girl.
Okay, so you're asking why does this happen?
Yes, that's more accurate.
Because we're social animals and we
Yeah,
need
but there's
to be.
more to it than that.
Is there?
Sure. For example, so we're moral animals that have a sense of the future.
Sure.
Okay, that makes us unique, and that structures our morality.
No, actually, there are other animals that can predict the future, or not,
Not
predict
really.
the future. No, tigers. Actually, there was a tiger at the SF Zoo that killed somebody, and so
Hunting
actually,
animals. Look,
no. Kids threw shit at the tiger. The tiger actually plotted its escape, and it found the
I'm not
kids.
saying that animals can't think.
Okay.
No,
let's
but they can
pause
perceive
here.
the future. Is what I'm saying.
Well-
Voted out by the majority.
Thank you, man.
Good man. Yeah.
That was boring. I don't understand what the atheists are here.
How you doing?
Oh, that's a guy. Okay. Honestly, if you put a gun to my head, I would have said, okay, that's a girl.
To meet you.
Good to see you, Luke.
So your claim that
Oh,
morality,
okay, he looks more like a guy from the side. He looks like a guy now. From the front, he doesn't.
purpose can only be found in science is a little shaky, because I think that your claim is really being framed to be morality and purpose can only be found in religion. Is that how you're kind of framing it?
I would say that the domain of religion is the domain of morality and purpose. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And also that science is actually structured, at least in part technically, to eliminate such considerations from its purview a priori.
Okay.
Right? That's why we define science as value free.
Mm-hmm.
But that has to be wrong because scientists have to prioritize their attention towards something before they can even engage in observation.
Okay.
And that act of prioritization of attention is a value predicated act. And so I can continue. There's all sorts of things we have to assume
Yeah.
about science before it can
Okay,
take
this
place.
is really good.
Okay, so what I'm specifically
It's really good. To explain further, if you want to do science, for example, you have to assume that you should follow the scientific method. Because if you didn't think you should follow the scientific method, then there's nothing stopping other people or even yourself from just completely doing it backwards, for instance. Or saying, well, it's true because it's true. Then you say, well, that's not the case. Why? Because you should follow the scientific method. So ethicality, morality, is assumed in the scientific method. So that's a really good point. Now, where do you get ethics from and morality? Well, you can't get it from science, clearly, because that was just articulated. You got to go somewhere else. Now, he says religion, I would say God, Father, Son, Holy Ghost.
Pointing out here is about religion in particular, since you yourself are a Christian, right?
That's, people debate about that, and I generally don't discuss it publicly.
Okay, I understand that. And me, myself, I am a former young earth creationist fundamentalist.
Oh, yeah.
So I have experience in this. I used to run a TikTok channel directed about apologetics about the Bible, specifically in this type of facet with morality, evolution and such, and going back and forth with that. So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yeah.
Oh my God, here we go. Well, the Bible has slavery, so it's wrong. It's like, it's wrong, it's immoral, and, you know, how do I ground morality? Well, it feels wrong. God.
Yes, so in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery's wrong, I think it should say that.
It says that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says it's immoral.
That's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave? Isn't that immoral? Wouldn't you say that culturally we've evolved as a species as...
Here we go. Is, ought, again. Oh, well, culturally we've evolved, and, you know, we think that slavery is wrong, so therefore it's wrong.
He said earlier about empathy.
Yeah, I would say that the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God.
Wouldn't you say
slavery and morality?
You know what I just caught?
And the presumption that
look at her.
Every person was made in the image of God.
And I'm going to assume, so call me like, oh, well, you're jumping to conclusions. I can almost guarantee that she probably thinks, well, the white man used Christianity to enslave black people, so like morality doesn't actually come from, or I gotta make it more, morality doesn't actually come from, I can't do it, but I can do this, morality doesn't come from Christianity.
So slavery itself became immoral, and that was established by Protestant Christians in the UK, who then convinced the UK government for 200 years to go to war on slavery.
And wouldn't you say that this is about the cultural evolution of humans in general, rather than just Christianity?
No, I think it's the flowering of the ideas that were embedded in the biblical texts across long spans of time.
I feel like this is just humans editing based on the cultural evolution.
And what do you mean
morality.
by just?
So Peterson should be responding here and saying, well, how can you ground morality? And then, you know, talking about that subject. Because the whole point is that there's an assumption that slavery in the Bible is wrong. So a person should articulate why that's the case. And then we would explain the internal coherence of our position, how this is the only way you can account for morality in the first place.
Just?
Yeah, just humans.
Well, humans.
Editing.
Well, based on culture and history, right? We get
Well, they did do it based on culture and history, but culture and history have their foundations too. So.
Well, yeah, but we're talking about slavery. So many people bolstered it based on the Bible. Based on the Bible. They looked at it and they justified it in the United States and the Deep South. They justified slavery.
Yeah, but the main thrust of Protestant thought in particular was stringently against slavery, and it was about the only movement in the history of the human race that had an anti-slavery direction.
Which was driven by humans and their understanding
that's one
of
way
morality.
Well, it depends.
It's the same with women's suffrage. I mean, women's in the
What do you mean it was driven by humans? Humans drove slavery too.
Yes, exactly.
So there's no argument there. If slavery and anti-slavery were both driven by humans, what does your claim that they were driven by humans have to do with it?
Evolving morality based on the culture that within the society that they live in.
Okay, fine.
So with women's suffrage as well as a very similar topic, in the Bible. There are denominations in Christianity, such as Pentecostal movement, which do bolster women to be pastors, right? Which I think that's a great thing to do. But most like to disregard
Where do you
women.
think the idea that human beings were sufficiently equal to all vote and not be slaves came from?
Humans.
Yeah, but so did the idea of slavery.
So did the
that's
idea of God.
fine, but what's
Yes.
your point? Like, you're not making an argument. You're just saying all thoughts come from humans,
Yes.
regardless of the thoughts.
It's not driven by.
Okay, Peterson's right about that. I understand he's saying that, well, he's making an argument about, well, it culturally evolves over time, and that's how we got to the point. I understand he's saying that, right? But the problem is that his claim basically goes nowhere. That's the point. Like, even if it's derived from culture, who cares? So, like, maybe on this level of all of it being derived from humans, maybe that's not the right level to say there is no argument, but the level above that in saying, well, it's culturally derived, that's not an argument. So he's right about that.
A higher power
It
that's
logically
driven on our
entails
experiences
define
as
higher.
humans, which is what is best for all people.
Is it driven by conscience?
It could be. Which conscious is also something that has evolved over time, and I think that's
What's
something
the
that does evolve in morality and empathy.
Okay, I don't understand the point that you're making.
My point is that God influenced slavery. People looked at the Bible and went, "This is moral because God says so." Just like women's suffrage,
There's lots
and
of
just like homosexuality.
all humans.
And also, so his argument is basically, okay, well, this guy, I forgot his name, this guy who I can't tell if it's a guy or a girl depending on the camera angle, this guy. I could say, well, this guy actually motivated me to join Antifa and, I don't know, do something to some school. That's basically his argument.
Societies were slave owning, so
And
you
yes, it
can't
is
blame that on the
That's
Bible.
the point.
if humanity decided,
Oh wait, address that first.
What, about
All
slavery?
human societies were slavers, so you can't blame that on the Bible.
well, you can say it bolstered it.
Well, not if you look at the broad sweep of history, because it was the Protestant Christians
Based
in
on
the
their
UK.
interpretation of the Bible,
It was the Protestant
which
Christians in
evolves over time.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
All right. Well, it was great talking
Yeah,
with you.
nice
sir.
talking to you too.
Yes.
Dr. Peterson,
Good to see you, man.
pleasure.
What's your name?
Bro, I keep seeing Parker almost get it, and like, part of me wants to hear Parker talk, because then I could break down why he's saying stupid, but then at the same time, it's like, he's so brain numbing to listen to.
Brian. So the first thing I would like to say is I would like to engage in this discussion in a symbiotic manner. I would not like to engage where there is one clear winner and one clear loser. Emotions are activated and it ultimately comes about ego. So I'm just saying I'm really trying to understand your position, and I would just like you to really try to understand my position.
Deal.
Okay, sounds good. With that, if you're saying that morality and purpose cannot come from science, is the opposite of that true, that morality and purpose can only come from God?
That's a way of defining it, yes.
Okay.
That's right, that's good. So I would say that with regard to the first claim, say, atheists don't understand what they're rejecting, because I would say by definition, God is the unity upon which moral claims are based. That's a
Okay.
definition.
Okay, if there is a God, what is the purpose of life?
Well, in the Christian tradition, the purpose of life is to engage in voluntary, upward, self-sacrifice so that the kingdom of heaven can be established on earth.
So you're trying to make it to heaven and avoid hell.
Yes, that's
Okay.
a good way of thinking about
What
it.
is the purpose of heaven? Do you understand?
Well,
so here's the deal.
At
We
minimum,
can get
it's
into
the
an
opposite
infinite.
of endless suffering. How about that?
Okay, and so should we not try to achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth? And if we can achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth
mean
without
avoiding-
God,
you mean avoiding it.
avoiding it, if we can do that without God, then does that defeat your claim?
No, it does not, because this is ontological versus epistemic confusion.
Well, yeah, except that it doesn't, you circumvented my initial definition, because I said that by definition, God was the unified source of morality.
So in a really unphilosophical, well, philosophy is a very broad term, but I would say like he's defining it in a very psychological way. He's saying that you can't epistemically ground it.
And so if we engage in a moral exercise...
And when you're talking about morality, though, when you really reverse engineer it and you get it down to its root, you're a psychologist, it really seems like it just has to deal with motivation. People are saying there is a God,
It's more specific than that.
God is
so let me ask you this. So if there is a God and there is a moral code and it doesn't come at your benefit, are you going to follow it?
It depends on how you define your benefit. If
it's going to come at your expense, would you still follow it? If God came down and
you should follow it, but whether or not a person does follow it does not matter. This is a form of an ad hominem fallacy.
Said, here is my moral code, and you should follow it, but even if you follow it, you are still going to end up in hell. Are you going to follow it?
That's like saying can God create a square circle? It's a logically incoherent scenario. That cannot happen in any possible world.
Well, that was the question that was put to Job and to Christ, right? Because they were required... Hang on, I'm answering your question. They were required to withstand trials that would break anyone and maintain their upward orientation regardless.
And they did that with the motivation of believing that this omnipotent, all-loving God would somehow turn it into a benefit. So they still did it solely for their...
And then people are like, dude, this is literally a form of an ad hominem fallacy. Like, I already explained. I don't feel like explaining it.
Benefit. So
no,
when you...
Well,
yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Hang on. Let's define benefit. Like, if I did something for your sister... would that be to your benefit? Like, how are you defining your benefit? Do you mean one of your whims gratified now? Or
I'm getting dehydrated, so I have to drink this crap. I bought like 3 cases of these, and it tastes like crap. So, I mean, I'm out of water, and I don't feel like getting up to get more, so... excuse the expression.
Or do you mean you and everyone you love and know over some reasonable span of time?
So
what do you mean by
when you're talking about whims, I think you're talking about something that's more dopamine. When you're talking about morality, you're talking about something that's more serotonin and more ultimately satisfying. So you and I agree on a lot. I mean, when it comes to talking about how men should be masculine and things of that nature, you and I are 100% in agreement. We just don't agree.
It's funny how he probably just lost like 90% of the people who are sitting around him.
Agree on the justification that God is the only thing that provides morality.
It's not a justification, it's a definition.
What's the difference then between a definition and a justification? I mean, it's ultimately psychologically the same thing.
Well, we have to define what we're talking about before we can just debate.
Okay, well,
right?
so here's my position.
So I said that God, among other things...
I'm actually a non-theist. I'm not an atheist. I believe the human condition is one of uncertainty. And what that means is that I don't believe that you can conclude there is a God with certainty, and I don't believe that you can conclude that there is a God without in the same position. Now, with that, I don't care. I still wake up every day and I have motivation to be a moral person.
Define moral.
Moral, what I ought to do.
Okay, and how do you come to that
And what I ought to
conclusion?
do, ultimately it comes down to what not just benefits me, but what benefits the entire planet, what benefits the entire system. I think that your entire moral perspective comes from linear thinking. And when you look at the reality of the universe, it's actually more so holistic. So when you look at how...
So how do you ground any of these logical assumptions you're making? Why are the laws of logic true? Because I think it is. Why is morality true? And he said this literally. Because I think it is, essentially. Okay, well, you can't make any claims about universals, like I said earlier. So you're stuck in a boat where you're literally, you, on your own worldview, can only justify your own existence. Actually, no, you can't even justify your own existence, but in a way, I mean, that's the strongest claim you can make is, I exist. And even that is weak. So this is the problem with the subjectivist. well, I think type of thing.
Aristotle defined God when he said that there had to be an unmoved moved or an uncaused cause.
Bad argument.
He was defining God from a linear perspective, and you do the same with morality, and you do the same with purpose.
How does my
I
definition
reject
of
that.
morality? How does my definition of morality hypothetically differ from yours?
Because you're saying that there's
I'm gonna go take a piss. Let me write down the timestamp so when I edit this, I'm not scrolling for ever. What the hell is my water? Or excuse me, marker.
something that exists in a vacuum, that it exists in and of itself. And nothing in the universe exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists in and of itself. It's a whole systems-based morality. It's a systems-based reality.
Is there a
and
hierarchical
that is
structure?
what the quantum...
Is there a hierarchical structure? Are some things more important than others?
Are some things... I think some things lead to more benefits than
Then,
others.
by your own definition, some things are more important than others.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
What
let's
is
pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Oh, God. All right, here we go.
How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I guess since you said morality and purpose cannot be found in science, it would just depend on like what you're referencing. If you're saying a description of your psychological preferences would be considered within science, sure. But I don't think that you have to say that it comes from science in order to be like an atheist. As an agnostic atheist, I don't know if God exists and I don't believe that a God exists. And the only ones that I would really reject would be like the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect notion of God that plenty of Christians like prescribe themselves. So I guess
How is that relevant to this claim?
you're basing a position of morality and purpose in some like notion of God that isn't the same type of notion of God that typical Christians would prescribe. Your notion of God is
What typical Christians?
yeah. Typically, when I talk to Christians, they say that they believe in an all-knowing.
About Cardinal Newman, who defined God as conscience. He has a major influence on all of Catholic social theory. How about that Christian?
Well, Carl Jung said,
Sure. So, do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean
How
when
is
you
it
say you
circular?
believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
I said you think it to be true.
All right. So if
What's
you
a belief?
believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that. It isn't something that you say. It isn't.
oh my God. Okay, yeah, this is going to be a total catastrophe. So, yeah, Jordan Peterson basically just said, I'm not a Christian. Because he kind of does the same thing atheist does. Like, well, I believe it, but then he doesn't articulate it to be universally true. But then he does through archetypes. So it's very confusing. You could tell he's not doing this from a philosophical perspective, rather a psychological perspective.
Something that's
It
associated
doesn't
with
make any
logical
sense.
consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action. And you're either fragmented, in which case you worship multiple gods, or there's some unity at the bottom of it that makes you an unstoppable force.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay. So then,
How would you define belief? Something you say?
Can I explain? Like, I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone like threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? Like, I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your
Don't be
life.
so sure.
You wouldn't lie to save your life.
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Again, this is kind of the psychological thing, again, because he's talking about Jung, the individuation process. And once you get to that point, you will die for your truths because you are sure of these truths. And I like the concept of individuation. I change it. I make it fit in with the Christian system. And I think it is a good thing to put into the system. I think it's an explication of what you can find in the Bible. But like as just a worldview, it's
Would you
very
lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
Now, can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany and
they're speaking two completely different languages here, and the thing is, I understand this at a pretty good level, and even not. Actually, if I look at this from the psychological perspective only, I understand everything Jordan Peterson is saying perfectly. But the problem is he's in the field of philosophical argumentation using psychological principles, which doesn't really work. So what happens is these people go to debate Jordan Peterson, or people go to debate Jordan Peterson with these philosophical presuppositions of what would be typical. And then he comes in with psychology, and they're just like this, because they're speaking two completely different languages. That's the problem with him in these debates.
it is the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them, would you lie to like the Nazis?
I would have done everything I bloody well could so I wouldn't be in that situation to begin with. It's a hypothetical and it's not answerable.
Hypotheticals?
No, I can't answer a hypothetical like that because
Did
it's
you eat
far.
today?
Look,
Did you
don't
eat
play
today?
games.
I'm not playing games. I'm just
Yes,
asking
you
if you
are.
ate it.
If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing game. I just told you I would do everything that I could.
I didn't. Why is Parker so pale? I never. Actually, on this monitor, it doesn't look too pale, but on this one, he does. Or maybe just the colors on the screen.
To make sure that I'm never in that situation. By the time you've got there, you've made so many mistakes that there's nothing you can do that isn't a sin.
Being born in Nazi Germany and trying to protect people that you care
Again,
about.
they're speaking two completely different languages.
There could be a Jewish friend that you have, and you want to protect them.
I think you should
have
just
them
give
in your
up on
attic.
that line of questioning.
Give up on just like trying to clarify your position? Because you
I
don't
did
like, are you like
clarify.
uncomfortable with me asking this question? It's just a basic hypothetical. Like I could ask you.
It's just a basic hypothetical where you're,
like
you
if you-
put Jews' lives at stake in Nazi Germany. That's just a basic hypothetical.
Obviously, you would lie in that scenario to save their life, but you're like not trying to answer this question for some reason.
I just told you why.
Are you anti-fascist? Like, so you're
Why are
anti-fascist?
you asking that?
I was just asking, just clarifying. But like, okay, again, you're not answering this hypothetical.
You asked Jordan Peterson of all people, you know, the person that shills for the... You asked him? You asked him of all people?
Because you know
What do
it
you
shows
think?
that you clearly would lie to save
I'm
someone's life.
answering it in
Obviously,
a
that's
manner
not what
you
truth
don't
is.
find acceptable.
Obviously, because I care about
you're-
truth.
I wouldn't be in that scenario.
Obviously, right? Logically, because that's already happened. Like that's in the past. You don't have a time to try.
Again, they're speaking two completely different languages. Jordan Peterson isn't saying anything about logic. He's saying things about the psychological process, and if you're in that situation, then that means you stuff about ego, shadow, etc. That's a very what I just said is a very simplified version of it, but God.
Travel device. We're bringing this logical hypothetical up to show you that in some circumstances that do happen within the real world, you would lie to save people's lives. So your definition of truth isn't actually how we're typically using it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to muddy the waters when I ask you, like, do you believe this? Do you think this to be true? So you don't actually have to answer the questions. And plenty of Christians don't like that because they clearly see that you don't really like want to be associated with
I can
Christianity.
imagine that I was in a situation where the best I could do as a consequence of my previous mistakes was to tell the least amount of lie I could manage. But that would likely indicate that I had made all sorts of catastrophic errors on my way there.
So you would lie to save someone's life. So again, you do believe it to be true in that circumstance, even though you like lied in that scenario. So
Not
clearly that's
without
not what
the
you see to be true.
context that I put it in.
You were not willing to
I
die for it.
said-
You were not willing to let other people die for it. So that's not what you see to be true then, seemingly.
You're doing exactly what I said you were doing at the beginning of the conversation. You're generating an impossible, restricted, hypothetical with no precursors.
Yeah, Dean and Parker do this thing all the time where they make the hypothetical, then they take your answer and complete. I had a debate with someone who's a agnostic, deist kind of person, and he kind of did the same thing where he's like, well, if you could save everyone, you know, from their suffering, would you do it right now? And it's like, well, you know, where are you asking that question? We're asking on the meta level where, you know, I have the attributes of God or to have my own attributes. Are you talking about the normative level? Like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, it's a simple question. No, it's not. Right? You can't just oversimplify things. And then once I gave him an answer with clarification, he completely simplified it to, oh, so you would. You wouldn't do it. Wow, you're a really bad person, basically. And it's like, okay, cool, bro. I mean, if you can only think on this level, that's cool, bro. And I broke down Dean Parker against Hayden Rhodes on abortion. Same kind of thing, these dumb hypotheticals.
To back me into a
How's it
corner.
possible? Is there something contradictory about it? Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
It wasn't that bad because he got voted out pretty quickly, and also it wasn't really a typical argument for him, so he didn't say what he usually says, which is retarded.
My next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists.
I agree with this.
Even though
This is
they
good.
might not know it.
Yes. But then, oh my god, this whole thing is just going to be them speaking two different languages.
Hi.
Good work.
Thank you.
Hi there.
I'm Zena. So I want to start off with like defining terms.
Yep.
How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. So almost like having a preference over something rather than the
It's a
other.
hierarchy of preferences.
Yeah.
And you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Right. So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you call it top or bottom, I
Yeah,
suppose. At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God. Is
That's
that
right.
correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's why we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Right. But at the bottom is God, and
That's a definition, yeah.
Yeah. So at the bottom is God, and there can be multiple people with different conceptions.
Okay, then now I'm understanding more. Like, why does, like, when people ask him, do you believe in God? Why does he just say this? Like, okay, now I'm understanding. Okay, what he believes to be God is the image of God, which the collective unconscious recognizes in the sense that they answer to it at the end of the day. I agree with that, but then you're completely stripping away the objective truth of a transcendental God. So no, he doesn't believe, he is not a Christian. Okay, he's basically a Gnostic. Okay, he's Gnostic in a very similar way to Carl Jung. So, okay. Question answered, finally. An hour in, well actually 39 minutes in I've been talking. I finally understand his position to a large extent.
Conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
It depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell, for example. That's what happens in totalitarian states.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying
So they're not all equal. Like, all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational. Right.
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than another one?
That's an excellent question. Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So repetition.
It's playability across multiple iterations.
So Peterson actually has the same problem as the atheist, if I understand his position correctly. So if his position, God is consciousness, that relates to foundational principle, God is the definition that this foundational principle is, and he defines one being better than the other as, okay, I believe it's playability, right? That means he's using something outside of this realm to justify this claim. So, in a way, he's actually in the same position as an atheist. He can't epistemically, metaphysically, any of these things ground anything because he doesn't believe in the position of the objective God. He believes in the position of the subjective God, where there's one God shared between humanity, as in a definition, the archetype, and each person has different values relating to it, but one can be better than the other because there's the problem. Okay.
Then you have a friend. The friend is better than having a game. Right? So that's one. Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Right. So we're explaining like characteristics that can be applied to like these types of like foundational values. But why is it that this iterability makes it better? And what does better mean?
Well, one hallmark of better is likely to be selected voluntarily.
Right.
So it's invitational.
Another descriptive kind of quality. So we're talking about characteristics that in some type of system with a goal, an output being like, we could maybe say happiness, right? Or some type of
harmony.
Harmony,
yeah,
right?
That's better.
Jordan Peterson shouldn't be debating atheists, he should be debating Christians. Because like this is just so boring.
Happiness precisely because it's too short term.
Exactly. So as someone who is an atheist, right, I can explain that within a system, there are things that we can see as better or worse to meet this goal or meet this output. But
okay, though that's utilitarianism, which falls apart on its own assumptions.
We're interested in though is what could make these things, regardless of any system, right?
Well, imagine that you set up a system and you implement it, and it produces the opposite results to which you intend. Oh yeah, that's not a good system.
Exactly.
Right. So
why is it not a good system? Because again, Peterson has the same problem where he doesn't have an objective source of God, unless he's being he's extremely obfuscating when he's saying foundational principle, definition of God, archetype. Like he's given multiple different angles for me to understand his position. So I'm pretty sure that what I just said applies.
the foundational principles are lacking because when you implement them, the game degenerates instead of moving towards the aim.
Right.
Okay.
So
How do you know if something degenerates or it doesn't degenerate? Well, it's obvious. I assume you would say something like that, but that's a fallacy. So
talking about within a system, when we talk about something being moral, right, just absolutely moral, it means that without a system, right, this thing is simply moral with no reason, like stands independent, this thing is good. So I'm trying to figure out if
no, I would not say that
such thing can exist. And if so, do you believe that these things are
let me make sure I
being
understand
moral, right?
Towards the aim.
Right.
Okay,
So we're talking about within a system. When we talk about something being moral, right, just absolutely moral, it means that without a system, right, this thing is simply moral with no reason, like stands independent, this thing is good. So I'm trying to figure out if such thing can exist.
Oh, okay. Okay. Excuse me. I responded to a straw man.
And if so, do you believe that these things are moral in of themselves, like self-evidently moral, or are they moral in accordance with the system?
I can't define them any more accurately than I already did, really.
Okay. In regards to...
I mean, that's a very big... I hate to say that's a basic question, but like, you can at least try to answer it. I mean, I don't think you really answered it before, because again, they're speaking two different languages. She asked that from a philosophical perspective. Jordan Peterson has not answered it from that angle. So again, same thing, just talking two different languages.
Morality, when we talk about the divine, when we talk about God and religion, these moral tenets and religion, right, and God exists as good because it is God, right? So it's self-evident, right? Without any kind of goal or output, this thing is good. So I want to figure out how...
There's an element of that that's true. So for example, in the story of Job, Job is unfairly tortured in consequence of a bet between God and Satan. And so Job is emblematic of someone who's being hurt for no apparent reason. Okay, so Job's response to that is that he refuses to lose faith in himself, and he refuses to lose faith in the ultimate goodness of being. Okay, and those are axiomatic decisions. They're not exactly evidence dependent because he is suffering. There's an arbitrariness in that that's reminiscent of what you claim.
So I'm essentially trying to figure out, do you believe that something can be good, like stance independently, something that can be good?
I don't know what you mean by stance independent.
Okay, so
you
I mean
independent of people?
Independent of people. We can use that, or more so, I want to be more specific.
Independent of people, okay, this is interesting.
Something that can be good, right, regardless of any end goal. It's just good.
No, I think good is tied up with goal.
Goal, okay.
Yeah, okay. I wish he answered the question specifically about people, but yeah, no, as Christians we would say morals are eternal and transcend humanity. So again, that's another point that is of major, not minor disagreement, but major disagreement.
Okay, I completely agree. So in a sense, this is why...
That's why the religious goal in Christianity is the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's goal dependent.
Okay, right.
So it's in reference to a goal.
Yeah, no. So he's confusing the fact that morality ends up leading to goal rather than and that therefore meaning morality is completely contingent on goals. Those are two separate things.
So,
or the goal would be the
but
imitation of Christ.
Someone's goal, right, can be something that doesn't encompass being in congruence with God or being with God.
No, the thing that they want to be in congruence.
Oh, right, okay.
That's right. That's right. That's good. That's great. The thing they want to be in congruence with is fundamentally equivalent to their God.
So what makes someone a Christian and what makes someone not a Christian? What makes like that's what I'm
good
talking
question.
about.
That's a good question.
Yes.
Yeah, well, probably the deepest answer to that is willingness to shoulder your cross voluntarily and trudge uphill regardless of circumstances.
Okay, so if someone can.
Yeah, again, so he's like he totally views Christianity from the Jungian Gnostic lens, totally, like completely. And then, like at least Jung doesn't make people think that he's like a traditional Christian, you know, all these philosophical things. Peterson obfuscates his position so much that it takes 44 minutes to do a video for him to say something that he should have said from the start.
Believe in someone can have a God because in your definition, your first preference, that is God, right? So someone can believe in God, right, and not be a Christian, right?
Yeah, well, there's a statement that Christ makes in the Gospels. He says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven.
So not that they're even saying that they believe in God, but they just...
I don't know, but that's why I'm saying this to you, is that Christ himself points out that there's a difference between people who say they believe and people who act it out. And the fundamental issue is the...
And I agree with him from this allegorical sense. Like allegorically, I agree with a lot of what Jung says about the Bible. But that's allegorical, right? It's not literal. They deny the literal for the favor of the allegorical, the archetypal, etc. I accept archetypal, allegorical. I think this is very useful. But this is predicated on that, the literal. This is the ultimate thing. And they don't have this. So that's the point that I would make. I think now people are and people who watch this video are starting to understand how Jordan Peterson actually isn't a Christian. Finally.
Action rather than the stated belief.
But he also says that, you know, to be saved, right, you must believe God has died for your sins or that God has resurrected in some way. So it's like, I don't necessarily think that we can take from the Bible and say that, like, acting in accordance with God necessarily means, or acting in accordance with, you know, the principles of God, like for example, sacrifice, like you talk about, means that you are Christian. I don't see how you can get that from that interpretation and then, you know, kind of justify it as
I don't think that the fact that you sacrifice is sufficient to make you Christian.
So can we repeat once again what you believe makes someone Christian?
There's many things, but one of the most fundamental is that you believe that the cosmos itself is founded on the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. Best founded. Let me offer you a contrary example.
So no, no. It's the principle of the cosmos is predicated on, I know I'm paraphrasing, but predicated on self-sacrifice. Like, if you, like, make a very long logical line, I could maybe see how you get there, but I would never say it in that way, because it obfuscates, if I was saying that, but I think I think that's probably the most clear he's ever been.
Well, I could assume that power rules, and so that my assumption would be, if I can make you do it, I win. Right, and I can found a whole society on that, and that happens a lot, by the way. And that's also how societies tend to degenerate. And so that would be a society that was founded on the principle that you get to sacrifice and I don't have to. Right, now the contrary to that would be something like you give up voluntarily and with courage all the things you need to situate yourself properly in relationship to the future and other people.
Right.
So then there's a harmony. That's why I talked about harmony earlier.
So you navigate your life, right, in accordance kind of to this principle of self-sacrifice. Can I say it in that way?
Yes, you can
Right.
definitely say it that
Thank
way. That's exactly right. And
Right.
navigate is the right term.
So someone does not have to have any awareness of Christ, of the story of Jesus, but let's say 60% of their actions, right, or more, whatever kind of metric you want to use, are in line with this
So the
self-sacrificial.
the Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages dealt exactly with that problem when they were talking about the pre-Christian philosophers, for example. And they noted the similarity, let's say, between pre-Christian Greek thought and later Christian thought, and presumed that there were moral actors outside the Christian domain.
Right.
They were
So is that
addressing
person
the
Christian
same-
though?
Okay. And I would agree with that, but that's not because of an archetype necessarily. It's because, I do think it's because of collective unconscious, but the collective unconscious is completely dependent on the existence of the God, objective God, a literal God, omniscient, omnipotent, etc., Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Okay? So, again, like, I agree with him, and then he completely just, like this is my bar, and he has this. He completely leaves out this. But you need the whole bar for it to be right. So, that's the current situation I'm in when viewing this.
Is that person
Well,
Christian?
to some degree, again, that's a matter of definition, because
Exactly.
they wouldn't be proclaiming Christian propositions, but they're acting out the pattern.
Of
Right? So,
Christianity.
so you imagine that full Christianity would involve a dozen things, and you can imagine someone who knows nothing of Christianity, say, acting out 8 of them.
Right.
Right.
So
then they'd be 8/12ths Christian or something like
8/12
that.
Christian.
Well,
but to be like a full Christian, how can someone say I am Christian? Like I am Christian, not 8/12, but Christian.
Well,
don't understand.
I hesitate to do that personally because I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming. The technical.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary. 8/12s or, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by belief. See, because I would say that acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief. Now, you could add to that what you say. So, maybe in the optimal situation, how you act and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same, right? But you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing, and you can imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So what I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, a really comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. But I don't see
why in boxes.
Like when I say in boxes, I mean like I can categorize you based on your actions, not based on necessarily what you say, but based on your actions that you are more so or less so Christian, right? Things like that, right? So we can categorize people as Christian.
Well, I would say more or less voluntarily self-sacrificing.
But that's also what we came to, though, is that someone can be like 60% or 70% Christian based on simply just acting in that way.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins is like that.
I watched that today.
Pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Very good.
Richard Dawkins.
Thank you so much.
Really, very thoughtful. Very good.
Thank you so much.
Really, very thoughtful.
Oh, well,
Hey, Dr.
here we go.
Peterson.
How you doing?
Danny, nice to meet you.
What's your name?
Danny.
Danny.
Oh, wait, this is the guy that just says logical problem of Trinity, logical problem of Trinity. This is that guy. Yeah, so, I'm not gonna, should I talk about LPT? I have a, whatever, if you want to know about LPT, logical problem of Trinity, just go to my Discord, Silu, scroll up a little bit. You'll see, and he's actually like one of the main people that talk about this thing. It would be funny, it would be really funny if you brought up the logical problem of the Trinity, because that would be completely, like, given what Peterson said, that would be completely, like, just missing the point of everything he's saying. But, let's see.
You're saying atheists worship things or people or places, whatever. Can you be very clear about your definition of worship again?
Attend to, prioritize, and sacrifice for.
Okay, that's it. That's your understanding of worship.
Well, I could flesh it out, but that'll do for the time we have.
Okay. Do Catholics attend to Mary?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So do they?
Oh my God! Here we go. Now he's just trying to. He's trying to trap him into saying something that sounds bad when he either doesn't understand his position or he's just trying to make him look bad. Because like if you understand what he's saying, And again, I disagree with him, so don't think I'm like, oh, I'm saying Jordan Peterson's a great guy. Probably said more negative things in this video about him than positive, but like you're talking about like this logic, like this is a equivocation fallacy. It's also a word concept fallacy. The way Peterson is talking about worship is very different from how you would say, well, the Catholics, they worship Mary. I'm not a Catholic, by the way. But the dumb criticism, like, the Catholics, they worship Mary. Like, using worship in two very different ways. So he's already doing this word concept fallacy thing, and he just sat down. So yeah, this guy's, here we go.
They fit that description of worship?
Yes.
So you would say Catholics and other people that revere Mary, like the Eastern Orthodox tradition, worship Mary.
Well, they might not put her in the highest
But
place.
you would put it that way.
No.
You just said it. Now you're taking it back.
There's
now?
still a hierarchy.
Okay, there's a hierarchy, but within
And there's something at the top.
See, is this what all these TikTok debaters do? They just do these little slimy arguments? Like, yes, he believes Catholics worship Mary, but the way he's using worship is very different from the way that would be offensive to the Catholic tradition. And the whole point of the argument is not that, well, if you think Catholics worship Mary, then therefore God doesn't exist. Like, that means nothing. That means literally nothing. That has nothing to do with anything. It doesn't have to do anything with this claim of everybody worships something they might not know. The whole point of the argument is just to make them look bad in a line of what I would call trick questioning, because it has no purpose of advancing the actual debate. It's just for the whole point of getting a clip of making them look bad. This is what these Dean, Parker, I guess this guy too, this is all they do. Like, really? Like, this is such, like, this is like when Muslims say, well, how can three be one? Come be a Muslim, we believe in one. And then dumb people are like, oh, that makes sense. Same thing they do. These people appeal to low IQ people.
All right, you can worship things
Mary is
below.
quite a ways up the hierarchy, but not at the top.
Let's go over your definition of worship again. What's your definition of worship?
Attend to.
Attend to.
Prioritize.
Do Catholics
And sacrifice for.
do Catholics attend to? Do they prioritize Mary over all other human beings?
No, I didn't say.
And see how we remove the word sacrifice? you could just tell, because, like, stopping at sacrifice wasn't just some random thing. He stopped at sacrifice because he knows that Catholics don't do that. He's just saying attend and the other word just so he could get him to say Catholics worship Mary. It's like, oh, all the Catholics hate you now. Like, this is so stupid.
Overall, did I? I didn't add that to my definition.
You understand.
I said there was a hierarchy as well.
You attend to
So you can attend to something trivially, or you can attend to it deeply.
Okay, now you're adding stuff to the definition, but your original definition.
Okay, yeah, so this is the other thing the other atheists was doing. Do they all do this? Like, the guy I was talking to, he did this too. Like, there's a difference between adding, as in changing because you got caught, versus fleshing a point out more. So you even heard him say, he gave a few words, and then Danny said, is that your full definition? He's like, well, given the time being, I could flesh it out more, but for now it'll be suffice. And then he uses that against him. Then when he fleshes out more, he says, well, you're adding to it. He's not, again, word concept fallacy. Very slimy, tricky debate tactics. There's two ways you can mean add. You can mean add as in, I'm adding additional clarification, or I'm adding another point so I don't look bad. One is completely reasonable within the context of debate. Another one completely wipes out your credibility, right? But he's using the word in a equivocal way, so therefore the viewer is left to assume one or the other. And in my case, because I'm not a retard, I'm assuming the one where he's adding clarification. But his audience and the type of people he appeals to will just pick the one that makes them look bad. Jordan Peterson bad, right? So this is all they do.
Hierarchy part at the beginning.
Are you
just
familiar?
didn't understand it.
Are you familiar with the Immaculate Conception?
Why is that relevant?
Because you go to a Catholic church, don't you? Or you've attended recently. You're interested in Catholicism, aren't you?
Sure.
All right. Are you familiar with their doctrine?
Okay, well, unfortunately, Danny does not understand that he doesn't actually believe in God as Catholics define it. Because everything he said, like, if he is a Catholic, which he clearly doesn't claim to be, right? Clearly, it's obvious. He was looking for 5 seconds. Like, I didn't even know he went to a Catholic church. Like, that's how little he makes it clear, right? But it's very clear that he doesn't agree with the position. He's literally, like, based on what he said, he's a heretic under Catholic doctrine. Traditional Catholic doctrine, at least. He's a heretic. So, like, bringing up this point is just so trivial, it's benign, and the whole point is just to make him look bad. Like, it doesn't really do anything to advance the debate subject.
Doctrines.
Somewhat.
Okay, you're
Their
familiar.
doctrines are very
How do they
deep.
regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either
it,
you're a
'cause I
Christian
won't
or you're
talk
not.
to you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I
Bro, just look at me. He's like, you're either a Christian or not. Which is it? And, mine's a lot more intimidating than his because he looks like a 5-year-old, but like, dude. Like, he said that, like, it was a life or death situation. Like, if you don't answer this, I'm going to do something about it. He just looks like a little kid. Dude, oh my God, I can't take these people seriously, bro.
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
And look at his frame. Like, look at his legs. Like, I think my arms are bigger than his legs. Oh my God.
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
Yeah, this guy's a little prick, bro. Like seriously, like. And again, am I here saying Jordan Peterson's right about everything? No, I literally just said that under Catholic doctrine he's a heretic. I'm not a Catholic, so I technically don't believe it from that perspective. But I mean, I said he's not a Christian. I said that multiple times. So I clearly disagree with him on a very foundational, fundamental points. I'm not just meat riding him, but like, dude, you're a prick. Like, come on.
You're really quite something.
This is what happens when you do these TikTok debates. You become this type of person. Like, this is what you turn into.
Hard time, but you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
What a prick. How old is he? Because he looks like he's built like a 12-year-old and he looks like a 5-year-old.
Hi there.
Hi, nice
What's
to meet
your
you.
name?
Gerard.
Hello, Gerard.
Nice to meet you, sir. So you've said that worship is when you prioritize and sacrifice for something, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a hierarchy in there.
Sure. So I prioritize and sacrifice for my wife more than I would prioritize and sacrifice for a random person on the street, right?
Probably. Yeah.
Presumably. Do I
I
worship
don't know.
my
I've
wife?
seen some pretty bad marriages.
Assuming a good marriage, are you saying I worship my wife?
I'm trying to define worship.
That's what I'm asking. So prioritize and sacrifice. I do
The
those
higher
things.
it is in the hierarchy, the more what you're doing is akin to worship. But even in your trivial acts of attention, you're prioritizing and partaking in worship, even if you don't know it.
So I am
And it's partly, well, with regard to your wife, say. So why do you value your wife? You do value your
Yes,
wife.
I love
okay.
her. So I
Right.
prioritize and I
Okay.
sacrifice for her.
Right. So that's within the confines of love, let's say.
Sure.
What else does it serve?
What else does what serve?
Your love and your marriage.
I mean, I am married to my wife because I love her. That's also why I prioritize and sacrifice for her. I certainly wouldn't think I worship her, and I don't think anyone else would make that.
I'm
Are you
trying to
making
make
that
it
claim?
definite.
Again, they're just disagreeing on semantics. This is like, is this all people talk about? Like, it's just so dumb.
Okay.
Yeah, that there's a hierarchy of attentional priority, and
Like how? Like, he's already talked to like 3 people on this exact subject, and you still don't understand that he's using worship in a completely different way than we colloquially use it. Like, how do you not understand that? He's been talking about this for like 20 minutes. Like, think. And the same thing with God. Like, you start using these typical like categories for God and the Christian God. Has he not made it clear that he doesn't believe in the traditional God that Christians affirm? He's like a Jungian Gnostic. Is that not obvious to any of you? Like, God, and he's even taking notes. Like, you take all these notes and you don't even like.
as you move up it or down it, depending on whether you think about it as a pinnacle or a foundation, you move more towards worship. Right. So even the small things. I'll give you an example. Imagine you go on a date. Well, imagine that your aim is a long-term relationship like a marriage. Okay, now imagine that your aim is short-term sexual gratification. Your pattern of attention is going to vary during the date, depend on your ultimate end. That's the hierarchy. The way that you attend to your wife is dependent on your ultimate aims, even if you don't know it.
So at what point is it worship? Because it sounds like you're saying worship is almost a spectrum, right? Or it's not a binary. It's not a.
It's kind of like that's a good question.
When is it worship as opposed to just I love my wife?
The closer you get to the top or the bottom, the more it's more like
how
worship.
Close to the top? Because I don't think I worship anything. And if you're saying I have to hit a certain threshold for it to be worship, it is possible I don't worship anything then, right?
It's not possible that you don't worship anything.
What do I worship?
Because you wouldn't attend. Well, love.
So you think I worship love?
Do you attend in consequence of love?
See,
I'm trying to define something. What do you mean worship? Well, I told you what I meant. What do you mean?
So I mean, something you worship is something that you have a reverential view for in a manner in which you believe it to be above and beyond normal things.
I think this word means one thing. Well, I think this word means another thing. Well, let's talk about it for an hour.
Like you.
So do you have that attitude towards your wife?
I have that.
Do you privilege her compared to other women?
Of course, I privilege her compared to other women, but I don't worship her. Nor does she worship me.
By the definition you just offered, yes, you do, because you just offered a definition that involved prioritization and elevation.
Well, and thinking that she is divine above and beyond what a normal natural phenomenon can be. Not other women, no, beyond any human being could ever be. I will prioritize her over any other human, but I don't think that she is.
You're making the assumption that only the thing at the top or the bottom has anything to do with worship, and I'm saying that's not true. It's a hierarchy of prioritization. And there's either something at the top or the bottom, depending on the metaphor, or you're fragmented and confused. Those are the only options.
Oh my God, the quality of this debate is making sense.
You're either going in many directions,
okay,
or you're going in one direction.
So let's suppose I'm fragmented and confused. Then you agree I don't worship anything.
No, then you worship multiple things.
So what's the threshold when it's worship, right? I prioritize a lot of stuff.
I said that the closer you get to the pinnacle, or the closer you get...
Can you give me some sort of metric? How close do I got to get to this pinnacle?
Do you know the difference between cheap literature and deep literature?
Yes.
Okay, that's the same issue. And how do you distinguish between them? What's the difference between cheap and deep?
I mean, it's really an opinion-based thing, right?
Is it? So it's just an opinion that Dostoevsky is better than a porno magazine.
Well, I've spoken to people who think To Kill a Mockingbird's cheap. It's one of my favorite books. So, I mean, people will differ on opinions.
Well, just because people are stupid about things doesn't mean that their opinion is valid.
That's certain.
Oh, my God. And yeah, he has a natural... Well, he's Catholic, so yeah, of course he has a natural foundation of this worldview.
I agree with that.
Okay, well, do you think there is a hierarchy in literary quality?
I think that there is a hierarchy to an extent in literary quality, but I think once you get to a certain threshold, it is just opinion. Like, I agree. Dostoevsky is better than a porno mag, but is F. Scott Fitzgerald better than Ernest Hemingway? I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. Why do you think that?
Because of what a book is, what literature is. Dostoevsky, he follows what literature is the purpose of more than the porno magazine.
Okay, good. Well,
so it's about purpose and definitions.
Sure. Let me give you an analog then. Okay. The depth of worship is analogous to depth of literary significance, and the closer you get to what's deep, the more religious and worshipful your practice.
So
and maybe you don't know what's at the bottom, but something needs to be, or you're confused.
Well, so to use your analogy, then how deep do I have to go for it to be worship? Do I have to be Catcher in the Rye? Do I have to be War and Peace? Or
it depends on what you're seeking for.
I'm seeking to know whether I worship something. You've claimed I worship something, and I want to know. If you want
to have a deep and meaningful life, then you have to go all the way to the bottom or the top, and insofar as you're capable of doing that, because otherwise you'll be fragmented and miserable and anxiety-ridden and hopeless.
So I have to worship something to have a meaningful life. And if
there's no difference between those two things.
Again, they're just speaking two completely different languages. I mostly fault this guy because he just doesn't understand what he's talking about. Because I already talked about it. I don't think I'm talking about it again.
Okay.
They're the same thing.
So if I don't worship anything, my life will not be meaningful, correct?
Well, that's the definition of nihilism.
Okay. So if I'm a nihilist, I don't worship anything.
That's true. And then you...
okay. Mm-hmm. You just said everybody worships something. I think you just agreed there is a class of people that doesn't.
Well, they're incoherent in their worship, and hand gestures like that aren't going to help.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, if you're incoherent and fragmented and aimless, which is what happens if you're objects of worship are unstructured and chaotic, then you're going to be anxiety-ridden and without hope. That happens. That's a technical argument.
But there's happy nihilists.
Oh,
How do you explain that there are happy nihilists then? Because
well,
you just said they
the
can't
mere
be.
fact that you state that there are happy...
And that's not even true. Like, how do you... This is supposed to be his field, and I think that's wrong. Because I think even nihilists have an image of God. They just don't accept that within their philosophical system. Right? Even if you're a nihilist, you are...
be nihilists doesn't make
something.
it true. Like, what's your evidence? That how do you measure nihilism, and how have you associated it with happiness, and what's your definition of happiness, and have you compared them to religious people? Because if you do, by the way, it's clearly the case that religious people over the long run have better mental health. It's a well-documented fact in psychological literature. So your claim is just a claim. It doesn't stand on anything.
So you disagree with the claim that there exists even one happy nihilist?
I didn't say that.
Okay, would you agree there exists at least one happy nihilist in the universe?
It's not a question that has any meaning as far as I'm concerned, because it depends on what you mean by happy, and it depends on the duration that you're trying to calculate over. Now and then, there's probably some deluded soul who thinks he's a nihilist who's momentarily pleased with himself. But as a long-term strategy to deal with the future, to get along with yourself and with others, it's sadly lacking. That's why Nietzsche warned that when God died, as he announced in 1850, that people would be flooded with pointless, anxiety-ridden, hopeless nihilism. And that was what would attract them for example, to the false gods of totalitarianism, which is exactly what happened, because everybody worships something, even atheists who think they don't.
Aren't there unhappy Christians or devoted believers? So worshipping something is neither sufficient nor necessary for happiness then?
Well, terrible things can come your way regardless, and that does happen, but it's the case that even when circumstances become deeply troublesome, that how you're oriented makes a big difference. So I'll give you an example. So the book of Job deals with the issue of unfair suffering. So Job is a good man who has everything taken away from him in the most painful possible way.
To settle it, right?
With Satan, yes. And so he makes the axiomatic presumption that he won't lose faith in himself or in the spirit of being itself, and that helps him remain calm and forward-looking through his time of trial.
Doesn't he absolutely curse God?
No, his wife tells him to do that. Yeah, good. My final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the...
If you mean it like ontologically, that is the case. Epistemically, no.
Religion's foundational stories. Hi there.
It's very nice to meet you.
What's your name?
I'm Ian.
Hi, Ian.
Yes. So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too.
Here we go. Like just straight springboarding right into it. Okay. At least he's not obfuscating, I guess.
He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
So then God doesn't fit within Christian ethics?
Well, the biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text. There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text. And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But that's a mistake, I think. It's an analytic mistake, what you're doing. But
this guy's built like a sloth.
That's a mistake, I think. It's an analytic mistake because you're putting the cart before the horse.
I really don't think so. I think that if we say that...
No, I don't know if he means in the way I think, but yeah, he is putting the cart before the horse, because he's saying that, well, these Bible stories, bad. Okay, well, where do you derive morality from? To say that these stories are bad, it's assumed in the preface. Now, you could also say, well, it's actually an internal critique. I'm not assuming morality. Okay, well, even that requires morality, because to make an internal critique, you need logic, so you need to epistemically ground it. You also have to metaphysically ground it, and you also have to ethically ground it, because logic assumes ethics. So, yeah, he is putting the cart before the horse in his argument. Now, does Jordan Peterson mean that in the same way I mean it? I don't know, but that is true.
Something is Christian ethics, then I think that all of the books essential to Christianity would fit with it, especially if it's like the main character. When we're talking about
how do you deal with
God,
the morality of war?
So
how do you think you should deal with the morality of war?
Sure. Because I feel like the morality, like I feel like Christian ethics, like this is kind of, I guess I just think it's like kind of an absurdity to say that God doesn't fit within Christian ethics, but sure, well, we can go on my ethics. That's totally fine.
I don't know what you mean by an absurdity. What game are you playing with?
Well, I just just think that it's an absurdity to say that the Christian God doesn't fit within Christian ethics, that like the Christian
I
God
didn't
isn't
say
like
that.
Christian
I
ethical.
said that the specific statements that you made don't take the context of the stories into account, and so that your analytical approach is faulty.
Sure.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Sure, then let's go
Thank
through the
you.
example. Yeah, so, and I apologize. So let's go through the example. So in 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, go and slaughter the Amalekites, slaughter the men, the women, the children, the infants. What's the justification for that? Is that in line
That's a
with
good
Christian
question.
ethics?
That's a good question. I don't really know what to do with the terrible, blood-soaked, saturated history of the human past. I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. I mean, what you try to do in your own life, as far as I can tell, is to conduct yourself in a manner that makes such things much more unlikely.
I totally agree.
We're all saddled with the problem of the catastrophes that got us here, aren't we?
Yeah, but this one was...
I don't feel like sitting here and explaining the nuances of the commands and all this other stuff, but at the end of the day, the way I because that just gets into a bunch of stuff that honestly is not worth talking about with an atheist, because they can't even get out of the starting gates, because they can't ground logic, they can't ground morality, they can't ground their internal critique, they can't ground ethics, they can't ground epistemology, they can't ground anything. So there's no point in like explaining the story. But on a rhetorical level, it's useful to explain the story. But on a logical level, simply in terms of argument, there's no point. Okay, so I'm viewing this as an argument. I don't feel like going over rhetorical stuff, because I mean I skipped a bunch of rhetorical stuff I should have gone over, but from that perspective. But yeah, it's just this argument against Christianity doesn't work.
Commanded by God. That's the problem.
Yeah,
That's
well,
what differentiates it from anything else, is that this one, it's God saying, go and do this atrocity.
Do you think that there's ever such a thing as a righteous war?
I'm skeptical. I'm not sure. It would probably be situational.
Well, right, fair enough.
Yeah, but this one certainly wasn't a just war. The context for the Amalekite slaughter is that 400 years earlier, they fought one battle, which they lost, and God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them off the face of the goddamn earth. And then 400 years later, he commands...
There's a lot of assumptions being made in this argument, which can't be grounded.
The Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all. And also, a genocide is not a war.
Well, a genocide can be a war, but...
Absolutely not.
Nope.
The genociding of the Amalekites, the men, the women, and the infants, that's not a war. The infants aren't combatants.
Look, I already said that it's very difficult to look at the blood-soaked past and to know exactly what to do about it. The answer I gave to the gentleman who is sitting here before you is that it's necessary to read a text like the Bible at all of its levels of analysis simultaneously. And there's a directional morality that emerges across time that has its roots in the Old Testament, for example, with its restrictions against murder specifically, that makes itself manifest in the Christian texts as the insistence on voluntary self-sacrifice as the foundational belief. That's a profoundly anti-violence ethos.
Do you have the belief in your theology?
Well, what do you think of that? Wait a sec. Now, address what I just said.
So I'm about to address it, but I'm addressing it with a question. Do you think that God is by his very essence perfect?
So again, like, dude, how long is it going to take for you guys to understand that he doesn't believe in God as traditional Christians understand it? Like, you keep engaging him in these philosophical, logical, retard atheist critiques when they don't even apply to him because he's a Jungian Gnostic. Okay? So, like...
You'll have to provide more...
Sure, just like maximally great and all like the great making
definition.
qualities.
Sure.
Yeah, like flawless. Yeah. So,
okay,
so does a flawless thing change? Does a flawless thing reveal like more and better information over time, or would a flawless thing say, "Here's what's good.
Dude,
here's
like, he's not. He doesn't believe that, dude. Like, he's a Gnostic. Okay.
Absolute good thing to do at all circumstances in time.
Well, we know some of that.
Wait,
Tell the truth. That's one.
That's totally fine, but presumably...
No. You don't get to skate over that with that's totally fine.
It's a straw man of my position. It's a straw man of the argument. So the argument is that God...
Wait a sec. You said find one maxim that's transcendent across situations.
I didn't say any of those words. I'm not sure what conversation you're a part of.
Don't be a smartass.
I'm sorry.
Seriously. I mean it. If we're going to have a serious conversation, conduct yourself properly.
Okay.
Okay. Rephrase your question so that, because I must have missed it. I tried to answer it.
So in my mind, I guess by my lights, a perfect being doesn't change. A perfect being, if they're maximally good, maximally moral.
Does our understanding of the perfect being change?
Our understanding might, but
Okay, how do we distinguish? Well, I agree. How do we distinguish between that, though, at the human level?
How do we distinguish between
our transforming understanding of perfection and perfection itself?
Between our
we can only see through our own lenses.
Presumably, a perfect being would be revealing all of these aspects all the time, especially if God's outside of time. I don't know how a God who's outside of time is revealing different things at different times. That just seems like incoherent to me.
Imagine something that's perfect.
Sure.
And complete.
Sure.
Okay, and it's trying to communicate with creatures who are anything but that.
Sure.
Well, they're going to get it wrong.
Sure.
Okay, now wait a sec. Do you blame that on the interpreters or the phenomena itself?
Like,
for example, are you perfect in attending to your conscience?
Hold on. At the point in time when God is literally the one who created us, he could have created us in a way where we would always be receptive to these principles, where we don't have to go across like a learning curve where, maybe we'll understand like thousands of years in the future, maybe we'll do it. Oh, also, if you believe in an all-knowing God, then free will is impossible because
wait a sec. Let's not.
Do not make the retarded modally fallacious argument of saying, well, if God knows everything that will happen, then that means people don't have free will because it necessarily follows from God knowing something will happen that the person will do it. So it's actually fatalism. No, that's a modal fallacy. We don't say it's necessary. Okay, it's not our position.
Wait, because you threw free will into the mix.
Well, that was the answer to your question.
Yeah, and
you said, why wouldn't God? Well,
it's
1,000 years of deep thinking philosophers would disagree with you. But
okay, well, that's a fallacy. Just get me out of here.
And 1,000 years at least like the last 50 years of philosophers would disagree with you. These analytic philosophers, people like Graham Oppie make arguments about the incompatibility of omniscience and free will, that if God created this world, if he chose this world instead of that world, then he makes it causally inevitable every single action that you were going to make. If he made a world where we were just electrons and
again, so there's the modal fallacy argument.
Love, then none of this would have happened. But by making us in this world, knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future, it makes all of those events inevitable, which means that they're all causally determined, which means that we have no free will.
Okay, so that's a modal fallacy. Okay, I already explained that. And he's also speaking a completely different language from Jordan Peterson. He's using Graham Oppie arguments against people like William Lane Craig against Jordan Peterson. Like,
if you believe in an all-good God or an all-knowing God that made everything.
No, have it your way.
Okay, cool. So then the free will theodicy fails.
Well, it fails for you. That doesn't mean you've disproved it. I mean, you tried to make
argument.
Yes, you tried to make a case for a causally deterministic universe. I don't think there's any evidence for that at all.
Do you think that God could have created a different universe than the one that he created?
I have no idea.
Okay, so then there's going to be a double bind, right? So either he couldn't have done it, in which case he lacks a power, or he could have done it.
Okay, and then you have now this is a variation of the omnipotence paradox. Like, does this guy just go on like an atheist forum and look at like their pinned post and go like, hey guys, here's an argument.
In which case we don't have free will because he chose this world instead of that world, making
and then people are gonna watch us and go like, whoa, he's smart.
The events of this world instead of that world inevitable with his infallible knowledge.
I don't understand where you're headed.
Well, it just means that the free will defense fails. Like all this, like under your view,
he's not making the free will defense, dude. He's not making Alvin Plantinga arguments, William Lane Craig arguments, dude, or any type of traditional Christian argument. And by the way, I'm not a natural theologian, so I don't think I have a soft spot for William Lane Craig. But at the end of the day, I don't agree with their apologetic method. I'm a presuppositionalist, but. This is like he just doesn't like they don't understand that the angle Jordan Peterson has on
it. Free will, no problem. I don't know why it's relevant to the issue.
Do you acknowledge that under your view free will doesn't exist?
No.
Oh, then do you want to respond to the argument?
You'll have to phrase it more clearly so that someone like me can understand it.
Yeah, gotcha. So God already knows in advance everything that's going to happen, which means that by making this world instead of that world, everything is inevitable. Which means that God's act of causing this world instead of that world
doesn't mean determined.
It's causally inevitable if God chooses this world instead of that world.
Doesn't mean determined.
Causally inevitable means determined.
No, it doesn't.
Absolutely, yes, it does.
Well, have it your way.
Okay.
That's not the case.
You've been voted out by the majority.
Yeah, so again, modal fallacy, confusing necessity with something just happening.
Please return to your
William Lane Craig actually is a good example for this. I'll use his example. God's foreknowledge is like an infallible barometer. It will never be wrong, but the weather is not contingent on the barometer. It's like that. We're not claiming that the argument they make about the logical incoherence, omniscience, and free will is contingent on a premise having the word necessity in it. And we would deny necessity, right? So that's the fallacy there.
Very nice to meet you.
Very zippy. What's your name?
I'm Liam.
Hi, Liam. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm surrounded by atheists.
My question to you, let me scoot in, would be, what does it mean to accept Christian values precisely, or Christian morality?
It means to aim up as hard as you can, no matter what happens to you.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think that that's a very broad definition of what Christian
morality is. Yeah, but it'll come in handy at some point in your life.
Yeah, and then so now, like, I'm not going to repeat myself.
Right, but I think that many different disciplines and theologies.
Well, you asked for a truncated answer. Right? I mean, there's other ways of representing the situation, but I wanted to give you something that was kind of foundational, briefly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It doesn't mean it's exhaustive.
Yeah, yeah.
I could say that you would have to believe that Christ is God and He died for your sins.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But that's in a very difficult way to understand. That's the same claim.
Yeah, yeah. If there are other theologies and disciplines that have similar types of values, how then is that definition mean? Like, wouldn't those also be Christian values under your definition?
That's a good question. I spent a lot of time studying different religious systems from all over the world and found multiple interesting layers of concordance. Right. So, for example, in ancient Egypt, their god Horus, who was the reviving god of the totalitarian state, he was the god of attention. Right? And the Jews hypothetically came out of Egypt, and there was crosstalk between Egyptian and Jewish foundational morality, and then that led into Christianity. I mean, the human beings all over the world have come up with moral systems that fit roughly into a pattern, and they're very usefully studied. Now, I learned a lot about Christianity by studying Taoism, for example, a lot. So I think you can make a case that Christianity formalized the landscape of good and evil more comprehensively and in more detail than any other religious system, and I think that that's part of the reason that it defeated paganism and spread so broadly across the West and is still dominant, still understructures our culture, for example.
The way you feel about Horus or Taoism or something is how I feel about Christian morals, I think.
Yeah, but how do I feel about them?
Well, that you took inspiration from them, you learned from them. Maybe
that's a good start, because I would say that actually constitutes belief. Like you said, well, look, in Noah, in the story of Noah, right? Noah is inspired by the apprehension that all hell is going to break loose. Okay? He regards...
Bro, this is so boring. This is so stupid.
You've been going out.
That was good. That was good.
Hi.
Hello there. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. What's your name?
I'm Kamari. So I was curious about this Christian morality that you're talking about, because a lot of my issues with Christianity have to do with the base morality of it, specifically with the idea of the rapture and how we see people that aren't going to come up with us with the rapture, and that.
My biggest problem with Christianity is the rapture. Dude, most Christians don't even accept the rapture as rapture, right? As those Hispanic Pentecostals believe, and some other people believe.
Concept of heaven and hell, I don't really agree with that morality. But if you could explain that to me and how I do agree with that, I would love to hear.
Well, I can't explain the rapture to you because that isn't something I concern myself with, and that's more of a sectarian belief than something that's central to Christianity. Now, there's all sorts of evangelical Protestants who might disagree with that, but that doesn't have anything to do with me. You asked a deeper question with regard to, let's say, heaven and hell and judgment. Yeah. Well, that's a tough one, right? I mean, sin, you could put it this way, sin is what puts you in hell, right? And so then you might ask, well, how do you know you're in hell? How about you do anything to get out of it?
Can I ask
How about you know that you put yourself there?
Do you think, is sin a part of Christian morality?
What do you mean exactly? Sin is a part.
The
it's missing
of sin?
Okay, it's derived from an archery term, and it means to miss the target, right? And so it presumes that there's such a thing as a central target and that you can miss it in many ways. And the consequence of that will be your life will be ridden with anxiety, your life will be pointless, people will turn against you.
I don't believe in sin at all.
Do you believe in error? Have you made any mistakes?
What if I believe that the mistakes that you make, that they're fixable, and so that no sin is finite, and that
that's a Christian belief.
The idea of hell, I don't believe in it.
That's also a Christian belief, by the way.
A Christian belief is hell?
No, that there's no sin. There's one. The sin against the Holy Ghost is unforgivable, but that's really the sin against the process that would enable you to learn.
Okay. But there's a Christian belief that hell does exist, and if I commit sin, I'm going to go there, correct?
Yes.
So what if I... No, I don't believe in that. I think...
Oh, okay, that's a very oversimplified version, but okay, sure.
When you,
Okay,
can I
that's
explain a
what-
little bit?
sure, sure.
Okay. I think that when you commit sin, that it's because of a lot of environmental factors in your life, like where you were born and who you were raised by. And so there are certain things that lead you down a dangerous path. And once you are dead, I think you're kind of removed of that person. There's no like, there are no factors of the earth.
What? What are you talking? Like, you're providing an internal critique of Christianity, but you're not even gonna presuppose a Christian metaphysic about the soul? Like, she basically just said, sin doesn't make sense because it leaves the person when they die. When it's an internal critique of Christianity, when we would never say that. Oh my God.
What happens after death.
Right.
So I would ask you, in these times that you suffered terribly in ways that you thought would never end, do you believe that you had any causal role in that? Like, did you play a part in that?
In my own suffering?
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes I would say that there was a part that I played in
that's-
that.
okay,
but I
that's
also
the thing to
think
find
that
out.
I think that maybe it's like a concept of free will that I don't really believe in somewhat of free will, but I think that there are certain things in your life that lead you to do certain behaviors. And so when you commit those sins, you go to hell. I'm not too sure why you would still be reaping the consequences.
You don't just like, oh, I stole a candy bar, so now I'm gonna go to hell. Like, bro, I don't even feel like explaining it, dude. I'm here for 2 hours. Been listening to morons for the most. I mean, basically, for the most part, just listening to idiots.
Do you, like I said, I can't address that. Do you believe that you can change?
I do.
Do you believe you can change for the better?
I do.
Do you believe that when you change for the better, you abandon the things you've done in the past that weren't good?
I think that you can.
Okay, then that's very much in keeping with Christian doctrine.
Can you explain to me how that's in keeping with Christian doctrine?
Do you believe
Dude, like, bro, oh my God.
you go to hell for those things?
You believe you can improve,
Yeah.
right? And you believe that if you improved, you would let go of things that were impeding you. That's a sacrifice. You believe that improvement would be upward, and you believe that you have agency in that. Yeah, those are all Christian presuppositions.
I guess like this, maybe we have different opinions of what Christian morality is.
Yes, sounds
so I
like
think
it.
that my opinion of Christian morality is something that I don't really agree with. Maybe you would define that as like the foundations
Well,
of
let me
Christianity.
give you an example. So if you want to atone, which means to unify yourself and unify that with the world, then the first thing you have to do is figure out what you did wrong and admit it. That's a confession. No, I take nice to meet you.
Choose an atheist debate for 10 minutes on a claim of their choosing. Okay. Like, I was gonna say, please pick Parker or Danny, because I want to hear their arguments and just break them down why they're stupid, because it looks to be a little bit exciting. Okay, I would like lose some brain cells, but at least it's gonna be more exciting than what I just dealt with. But the problem is that Jordan Peterson doesn't even have the position that would be sufficient to critique in that way, or not sufficient, but it's like they're critiquing a straw man, basically. Like,
I picked Zena because I think she asked. Hi there.
My claim is Jordan Peterson's framework for understanding Christianity is probably not the one that the Bible intended us to use.
that's true. That's correct. That is correct. Now he's gonna try and use allegorical Jungian archetypal stuff, but this is a good claim.
In regards to the way that you interpret the Bible, I don't see.
And I already talked about this, so I'm just gonna slowly speed it up more and more and more.
You have said in
Get
some
out of here.
circumstances that there's not a way to kind of say whether or not ontologically the historical claims made by the Bible are true. Like, for example, the story of Cain and Abel. You've said that this story is like a meta-truth in the sense that it exists all throughout time, culturally. And the way that you define meta-truth, I don't see a distinction between that and like a metaphor, right? But and you also say that you cannot say whether this story was true. You can say that it exists eternally, metaphorically, but you can't say that it's true. And if you can't say that there are historical facts being said in the Bible as stories that weren't really said with much ambiguity, how can we say that we can understand the Bible in the way that it's meant to be interpreted? Like, if you cannot make any claims about these stories, right? You don't know whether they're true or false. How do you know that your interpretation is the correct way?
So that's why I picked you. You ask intelligent questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was good. What do they say? By their fruits you'll know them.
Okay.
Right. Well, so one of the things I look at is the impact of what I'm doing. Right. And so I know a lot of evangelical Christians, a lot of Catholics, a lot of Orthodox Christians, a lot of people from other faiths. And they've told me, like many of them, that they found my interpretations very helpful and that it deepened their faith. And so that.
Okay, so it turns it into a subjective personal experience / utilitarian position. Okay, Jordan Peterson loses his point very badly.
That's interesting because I wouldn't have necessarily expected that to be the case. And I've also talked to thousands of people who've told me that they came to understand the foundational stories of their culture better as a consequence of listening to me, and that they did everything they could to sort out their lives and that it worked. That's many different pieces of evidence that all converge on something like the practical and conceptual utility of my approach. Now, is it the same? There's a lot of approaches to biblical interpretation historically, and what I'm doing is possibly less new than you think.
Yeah, I want to make a claim on whether this evidence is enough, right, to substantiate whether or not your interpretation is going to, be more plausible, right? Be the most plausible. Because in regards
it's an open question.
Yeah, right.
You bet.
So in regards to how we interpret the Bible and how we see the Bible, something can add value to someone's life. An interpretation can add value to someone's life. An interpretation can connect you to your conception of what your faith is. But if it's the quote unquote interpretation that God does not intend, that can lead to a plethora.
That's certainly the case. That's why the medieval Christians were so concerned about heresy.
Exactly.
Yeah, because they felt, and that's why the Catholics objected so much to the Protestant Reformation, because they believed that the fractionation of Christianity would result in an indefinite fractionation, right? Well, and that's exactly what's happened.
Right.
So yeah, that's definitely a problem. I think one of the foundational principles, for example, there's a foundational principle in the Old Testament of hospitality, right? So what you want to do if you set up your local environment properly is to make it welcoming to people voluntarily. And so one of the ways you could judge the validity of the interpretation of the classic story is whether or not that interpretation might be regarded by someone as welcoming. Does that represent something you'd actually like to have if you were acting in your own interest in the long run?
Right, and we can talk about that. Like,
protect you from fear might be another one.
Exactly. So we can talk about how the interpretations of the Bible, if they kind of resonate with us. And I think that can in some case be some kind of evidence. Oh, this might be true, but I think we should ask: is evidence damning? Right? Is this evidence certain? Right. Yeah. So, but I do want to look at again the consequences and our understanding of this interpretation once more. So we look at again the story of Cain and Abel, and we say, yeah. So I believe this is a meta truth. I believe that this story is resonant throughout cultures. That is all Trinitarian. I'm sure that there is in some way, the story was put in here for the reason, right, to tell us about fights between brothers. But also, you can't say I do know or I don't know that this story is false or true in an ontological historical sense as a historical fact. Were there two people that were specifically referenced?
I don't think that's knowable, but I'm not sure why it matters to you.
So the reason why it matters to me is because we need to know how we should interpret the things that the Bible says.
Many ways.
Right, but if we interpret
sometimes poetry.
Okay, whatever, bro. This is gonna be a circle. Okay, that's the video. A lot of breakdown, a lot of stuff in there. Join the Discord, comment, whatever the hell you want to do. I'm out of here. I can't do this anymore.